Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sigh.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of him in glory will the toils of life repay.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. Onward to the prize before us, soon his beauty will behold. Soon the pearly gates will open, we shall tread the streets of gold.
when we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
when we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky.
We're in I'm calling the climax of his teaching. Mark is a very, very succinct gospel. Almost every account that he has that's parallel with other accounts is a shorter, more succinct version of that. That doesn't mean that there's not anything substantive here, and that doesn't mean it's not important. That actually means that we need to pay much closer attention to what is there. So he begins in chapter 5, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. Now, I hope this is all I'm going to say about this, but if we need to talk about it more, I will. There is some discrepancy here between Matthew's account. The name of where they are at is different, and it's a geographical issue. That geographical issue is created and blown up, I think, into a bigger thing than it needs to be. There are 2 or 3 different places on the east side of the Sea of Galilee that are identified by people as the location for this. One of them is a great distance from the sea and is obviously doesn't fit the description here. But historically, and the work that they've done they believe that that's actually the capital of the Gerasenes, and so they're like, okay, that's what he said, where he says it is, but it's not possible to be there. So that's the geographical conflict that exists. I think that our concept and understanding of the borders of these places just isn't very good. And so to say he went to the country of the Gerasenes doesn't mean that he went to a particular city in the region under the control. It means that he was in a place that was under the control of those people, and that's the way I read this. What is clear to me is that this place was close enough to the Sea of Galilee yet for it to be reached easily by crossing the sea and for the pigs to get into the lake. So it's on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, which would be outside of what we generally would look at as the Promised Land. But they've crossed the Sea of Galilee. It says, when Jesus stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Now, I think all of this is simply describing the rather unnatural power that he had. There aren't too many human beings that can just burst out of chains or overpower groups of people that are trying to bring them under control. This was an uncontrollable. Right. And he had the power of God with him. So we're getting a picture of that. And the reason that's important is because of what happened subsequent to this. This is again demonstrating the authority of the teacher whose teachings are being discussed. And so this is a description of the situation. This is a guy who is clearly on the outskirts of society. He is now living among the tombs. I presume that those are probably caves, but this is where bodies are buried. And he is not received by society very well. And he's not controlled by people very well. And in fact, it says, night and day among the tombs on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. And a great herd of pigs was feeding on the hillside. They begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. The unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. There's a lot about this that can be talked about. It's not my purpose in this class to necessarily examine all the nuances of this story. What I want us to concentrate on primarily is a couple aspects of it. First off, this was a man who was full of unclean spirits. Do we know how many? Well, that's how many pigs there were. Do we know how many unclean spirits were in him? He says, "What's your name?" And the answer was Legion. What does that word mean? Okay, that was roughly the size of a legion. There was about 10,000 soldiers, I understand, in a Roman legion. So I don't know that he was saying there's 10,000 of us. I think he was saying what? There's a bunch. This was not, and this is an explanation of why he couldn't be controlled, why he couldn't be overcome, why he couldn't be chained, why all this stuff that we learn about him is true. And so we're talking here about an individual that was possessed of many, that's the word that's used, many spirits. So many that they say, hey, we're legion. But what did they do? This is the interesting part to me. So it says that they see Jesus from afar. And what happens? They rush to him and bow down before him. And so we're not just talking about someone who has mastery and control and authority over nature. We just read that story, right? He's in the boat, he's asleep, there's a big storm arises, they all get excited, they wake him up, he says, peace, be still, the wind dies down, the seas calm down. They're amazed that even the wind and the seas obey his voice. But we're not just talking about one who has control over nature. Now we've got these demonic, that's our word, spirits, these evil spirits that are legion. And when they are confronted with Jesus, they do two things. Not only do they go to him, he doesn't have to go to them. They come to him and they bow down before him, and then they say something. And what does it say that they said? That he's Jesus, Son of the Most High God. And that's an important moniker to place on him. In other words, they know who he is. They know he's divine. That's why they prostrate themselves before him and make requests of him. What do we call that when you make a request of a divine being? What's that called? Prayer. Prayer. Do you realize that human beings live days and days and days and days and months and years sometimes and lifetimes sometimes without ever prostrating themselves before God and praying God? And yet, these evil spirits, the very first response they have is to prostrate themselves before Jesus, identify him as God, and make requests of him. Yes, sir, Mr. Bauer. Yes, it does. And there's other passages that I think are worthy of bringing into that. Even the demons believe and tremble. This is an excellent example of the truth of that text. But they recognize him, they identify him, they worship him, they offer prayer to him. How arrogant are we when we refuse to do such things? They ask, after he says, come out of the man, they say, well, just don't torment us. Have you come to torment us before the time? I think is how one of the parallels explained that. They understand his authority over them, and so they plead their case. Don't do that. And then there's this herd of 2,000 pigs, and they say, command that we go into the pigs. And he permits them to do that. They go into the pigs, and then the pigs commit suicide. When I got a lesson on this, I actually titled it Suicidal Swine. They run off the side of the hill into the water. I don't know what happened to the spirits after that. I'm guessing that that's probably not the outcome that they were thinking. But it demonstrates his authority and his power, not just over nature, but over all things, in the physical realm and in the spiritual realm. And I think that's the main focus that Mark has here. He's demonstrated his power over the physical realm by the calming of the storm story. Now he demonstrates his power over the spirits. Shows that even these spirits that are capable of possessing a man and incapable of being controlled by this whole community, all he has to do is speak, and they do what he says. That's the kind of authority and power that he has. And if the demons recognize his authority, and if the weather recognizes his authority, why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't we listen when he seeks to teach us and enlighten us about the things that are true and right and what we ought to be doing, what we ought not be doing? The herdsmen fled, it says, told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. And I know that's not the end of the paragraph, but I want to stop there, and I want us to just think about this, okay? The demons understand who he is, call him the Son of the Most High God, bow down before him, seek permission from him to do things. Men who have seen this and who have heard the firsthand accounts of what just happened, and they see the response. And by the way, I want you to think about this. Before this, we've got a man who's unclothed, who's uncontrollable, who's out of his mind, who yells and screams all the time and cuts himself with stones and makes it impossible for anyone to come around him. In fact, one of the other accounts actually says that people avoided going near him. And now he's clothed. He's in his right mind. He's seated there calmly. And instead of saying, okay, this Jesus commands this, and this is the result. Look at how much better he is. Let's see what he would say to us. How do they respond? They begged him to leave. Instead of begging him to stay, they begged him to leave. That unfortunately is what many people do with Jesus. If Jesus has the authority over all of these things, then he has the authority over us as well. And so if he stays, what does that mean? Raise your hand if you were somebody's child. All right, everybody's right in here. Good. I was going to be afraid. Do you remember when you were young? Did you always behave the same way when your mama and daddy weren't around as you did when they were around? Did you sometimes celebrate when they left? Why? What's the old idiom? When the cat's away, the mice will play. That's why they wanted him to go away. If he has that kind of authority, if he has that kind of authority over me, if he can command me what to do, how can I avoid that? Yeah, I don't know who the pigs belong to. That's one of the things that I raised in the sermon. Probably shouldn't have been there. Yes, ma'am. Yep, that's a potential issue. They may have been wild pigs, probably not. They probably belonged to someone. There certainly was someone who had a loss. But you know what? What would a man give in exchange for his soul? How many people left jobs to follow Jesus? Walked away from their livelihood. You'll recall in the book of Acts, in the preaching of the gospel in one city, these practitioners of the magic arts burned their books. That's the same thing. They were turning away from that lifestyle and away from the things that they had invested in that lifestyle and away from the money that they derived from that lifestyle. Now, there is an example of the one case where if you believe Paul's preaching, then idolatry is a problem, and if idolatry is a problem, we can't make our money, and they got mad at him because of that. But not everybody in the city did, and in this indication, the whole community says, just leave, get out of here. And I think it is because, and the key is the word afraid, they were afraid. Now, what exactly they were afraid of, I don't know, but what they saw was his authority. And so I have to conclude that they were afraid of his authority. They didn't want someone there who could command in such a way. And that's, I think, true of a lot of people today. They don't want to believe in God. They deny God's existence. Why do they deny God's existence? Because they want to do what they want to do. We like our freedom, don't we? Especially Americans. And especially Texans. We like our freedom. We don't like being told what to do. I think that's actually common to most humanity. And this is the exact opposite reaction to what they should have had. They should have begged him to stay and teach them, seeing that he was one who had authority. But instead, they just wanted to be left alone. One of the questions that I do ask, for what it's worth, I don't know how many Israelites lived along that coastline of the Sea of Galilee. My question was always, why was there so many pigs there in the first place? The Jews were not allowed to even feed a pig. That was one of my big questions. I don't even understand why there were 2,000 pigs roaming the countryside. They already were spurning the law of God. They began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. Verse 18 says, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. Now, I want you to see the contrast here. The city says, go away. So Jesus is accommodating them. And as he gets on the boat, the guy who had been freed is begging to stay with him. He did not permit him, but said, go home to your friends. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you, how he's had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. The Decapolis, that prefix, deca, means 10. And so this was an area of 10 cities, a region that was dominated by these 10 cities. And so he went home and he lived among people, and he told people what? He told people about how much the Lord had done for him and about the mercy he had received from the Lord. Now, this is a microcosm of what the disciples were going to have to do, what all of us have to do. We don't get to dwell with the Lord, do we? He's departed. What would he have us do as those who have received his mercy? What would he have us do? Go to be with him? Not immediately. What would he have us to do? But by the way, you know how I know it's not immediately? Because if he wanted us immediately to go to be with him, where would we be? It would all be over. And he would take those who are his back to be with him. That's yet to happen. He talks about that at the end of John, right? John 17. I go and prepare a place for you, that where I am, you may be also. And if I go and prepare a place, then I'll come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be. That's yet to happen. It's going to happen. But in the interim, what is his instruction? Go home among your friends and tell your friends the mercy that you have received from me. Is that not our duty? By the way, if you take this back to those two parables, the sower went out to sow a seed, and when you plant the seed, it doesn't just immediately produce fruit overnight, but instead the sower goes to bed and sleeps and gets up the next day, and then goes to bed and sleeps and gets up the next day, and it slowly grows, and it puts out a shoot first, and then it grows into a plant, and then the plant matures, and the plant has flowers, and then the plant sets fruit, but the fruit's still not ready, and so the grower has to do what? Wait until the fruit is mature, and then he makes the harvest. This is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. I want you to do what? I want you to tell people the mercy that you've received. That is what sowing the seed is. Our duty is to go out among our friends and to talk about the mercy that we received from Jesus. To talk about what God has done for us. To talk about the forgiveness of sins and the hope of eternal life. To talk about the fact that we were a lot more like that crazy man in the tombs than we would like to admit until we met the teaching of Jesus, which purified our hearts, which turned us away from sin, which made us attire ourselves properly, gave us control. Self-control is one of the characteristics of the Christian, right? Gave us control once again, and gave us the opportunity to go out amongst our friends and to say, look, I once was lost, but now I'm fine. I once was blind, but now I see. I once was a wild, crazy individual given to sin, but no longer. And to borrow Paul's language, if he can do this to the chief of sinners, he can do it for you. Yes, ma'am.
Modern American Judaism, there's a time of the season where they're allowed to eat the upper half of a pig. And then the other thing I was thinking is that maybe, although they can't eat pig back then, maybe they were allowed to make game from the pig by raising it and selling it to the Gentiles.
Actually, they were not. They were not allowed to touch a pig. It made them unclean. If they did so, they had to go through the purification rituals before they could approach God. Correct.
I was reading through it and I was cross-referencing it with where we're at in Mark chapter 5 and also looking at it in Luke chapter 8, where it has different accounts of the same situation.
Right.
And in the Matthew 8, I'm a little confused because it says 2 demon-possessed men, whereas in Mark and Luke only reference 1 demon-possessed man. So my question is, did Jesus only heal the one, or in this situation in Matthew, is it described as a plural demons within the one man?
That's a good question. I'll tell you this. If you have 2 men, then you also have 1. And so I don't have a problem with the number described. There could have been 2, and these accounts focus in on the one who had the multiple spirits. And it all depends on when you tell a story. This is a good question. This is a good opportunity to do some general teaching before we get to the specifics. When you tell a story, do you always tell every single piece of information about it? And when you listen to someone telling a story, you ever listen to someone who tells a story that includes all kind of details that have nothing to do with the information that you need? And what do you usually say? You may not say it out loud, but you say it. Get to the point. That's not helping me. I don't care about that. Tell me when you tell a story, you include the information that's pertinent to the point that you're making. And so, as I mentioned before, Mark is very succinct. The way that the Holy Spirit moved this to be written is very direct, and there's lots of information that is in some of the parallel accounts that Mark doesn't include because it's not essential to the story that Mark is telling. And when I use Mark, I'm not talking about the individual, I'm talking about the book. The story that's being told is what's important. And the important thing is that Jesus has control over all. Jesus has control over things that we don't have control over. Jesus orders our life. He makes our life better. And yet some people react to that by saying, Jesus, go away. And some people react to that by saying, Jesus, let me go with you. And Jesus says what? No, you have to live your life. You have to live in this earth now. But use your time doing what? Telling the story to help other people. Because guess what? Everybody else in that city, even though they weren't possessed by legion, everybody else in that city was lost apart from Christ. Everybody else needed to listen to Jesus. But at that point in time, they were choosing not to listen to Jesus. So what needed to happen? Someone needed to go out and sow the seed. And that's really the focus of the account here. There's also the potential possibility that it's not a direct parallel account in the case of the two men. But more than likely, I think it probably is. But that the fact that there was two has no bearing on the point that Mark is making. So he talks about the one. He talks about the one who was healed, the one who got his life in order, the one who wanted to go, and the one that he said, no, you have to stay here for a while longer. But while you wait, talk about the mercy that you've received. Because, well, I think I mentioned probably maybe in Wednesday night, but I think it was last Sunday. Anyway, doesn't matter when I mentioned it. We talked a little bit a while ago about influencers. Anybody know what influencers are? I know if you're over the age of 40, you may not. Okay, so these are social media people. That's all they do. That's all they've ever done. They make videos. And they publish these videos on things like YouTube and on Facebook and on Instagram and whatever's cool now that I don't even know about because I don't follow any of that stuff too much. All they do is they make videos and they talk about things and they tell people what they think, and people watch them and they hear them talk about whatever, a product, some clothing, a type of car, whatever they happen to be talking about. And what is the result, especially if they're popular influencers? When they say, hey, well, I'll tell you what the result is. This will illustrate the point extremely well. And it's in a negative light. There's positive influencers and there's negative influencers. Some of these influencers do things like, okay, hey, these little Tide Pods, aren't these cool? Look, watch, pop one in your mouth and see what happens. And they said that, and what happened? People started doing it. Now, to me, a sane person hears somebody say that and go, they're an idiot. I'm not going to do that. And by the way, I didn't. I had a bucket full of them on my washing machine when they were talking about that years ago. Had no interest in popping one in my mouth. Never even entertained the thought. But do you realize that millions of people did? Do you realize that all we have to do is talk about what God's done for us, and we can be an influence in the world? That there's somebody out there that will hear our story and say, that's what I need. And they'll come to Jesus instead of sending him away. We don't have to be a big name person to make a difference in this world. We have to do what he tells him to do. And I want you to notice this. This is the man who was crazy in the tombs and everybody was afraid of him. And verse 20 says, he went away and began to proclaim. Jesus said, go sow, and he went and sowed. Here's the question I have to ask me. Do I have as much faith as he did? Jesus has told me the same thing. Do I go and talk? Do I go and share? Do I talk about the mercy that we've received through Christ? I'm convinced if we're all doing it, just the people in this room. I'm not even going to talk about the people who are not in this room that'll be here in the next hour, or the people that'll be here tonight, or the people that aren't coming right now, but hopefully will come back someday. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about just the people that are in this room tonight. If we leave this place today and we start talking to our friends and our neighbors and saying, I have received mercy from God, and this is how it works and how it happened and what it has done in my life, I can almost guarantee you someone will turn to God. And when that happens, we won't be able to say, well, there's nobody interested, so I'm not going to go talk about it. Which is where a lot of us find ourselves. I can't get any Bible studies. Nobody's interested. I knew a situation like that. Someone actually made that statement. There's no one here that's interested. I work. I can't get any Bible studies. They brought in another man, and between the airport where his plane landed and where he met the local preacher, he scheduled 12 Bible studies. And the guy went, how did you do that? And he said, 7 words, will you study the Bible with me? If you never ask, it's never going to happen. I can't guarantee it's going to be that easy, but I can guarantee you this, that's what God wants us doing. If he wanted us in heaven, just like he calmed the sea, we would be in heaven. If he wanted us in heaven, just like he cast the evil spirits out of this man, we would be in heaven. If he wanted us with him, he would have told this man, come on. He did tell the 12 to follow him, didn't he? But this one, he says what? No, you stay here. I need someone talking about me here. You tell people what you have experienced in this place. And he did. And I think that we need to be doing that as well. All right, if the Lord wills, we'll pick up next time in verse 21. He now moves on to a couple of healings of Christ, where again we're seeing the power of this one who is teaching, the power of this one who is presenting, the power of the one who's asking us to share what we learn with others, his authority, his power, and his influence in the world. Thanks for your presence, participation, and comments.
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom. in that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall